Occupli, the largest Irish-based international provider of environmental health and safety, training, consultancy, recruitment, food safety and carbon services. Hi there, you're very welcome to the Occupli Podcast. It's John Drummy with you, and today I'm joined by Brian Murnane. Brian, you are Director of Carbon Action, which is an Occupli company. Who are you and what do you do exactly?
Well, Carbon Action is part of the Occupli group, as you say, and Occupli's strategy is to build a stable of solution providers in the EHS space. That's environment, health and safety. Carbon Action is the E part of that. It specialises in greenhouse gas management, and we do that through training and consultancy.
How long have you been doing this?
Me, about 8 years. Carbon Action's been around a little bit longer than that. Carbon Action was, I suppose, one of the aristocrats in the carbon business. It was set up by this company in 2009 because we believed at that time that decarbonization was a challenge. We wanted to get into that business. We were very much that first generation carbon company. And we paid the price of doing that because the rest of the world wasn't there yet. So we were somewhat ahead of our time. In retrospect, we would say that that was a very good learning DNA creating experience, even though we didn't make money doing it. But now the rest of the world is caught up and it's a good business.
Yeah, you're there ahead of your time. What was the general reaction from different businesses, different companies to be learning that we need to change things, we need to do things differently?
Well, the start of the company predated my involvement. From what I understand is that at that time people said, oh yeah, we've sort of been reading that carbon's a problem, but hasn't really washed over us yet. And we'll get there, but kicking it down the road, which is something that the whole world has done and some people continue to do. This is why the problem has gotten as bad as it is.
Yeah. What does Carbon Action do then?
Well, our mantra is that we either manage your carbon project or we'll teach you how to manage it, or both. Yeah. So carbon projects come in all shapes and sizes depending on what business you're in, what your stakeholder map is, what your specific challenges are. But we'll, as I say, bring our expertise to get you down that journey, depending on the journey you're on, or train your own people to do it yourselves.
We're always hearing about, I must reduce my carbon footprint and I must do this and I must do that. But is there an understanding of really what that means and what we're being asked to do?
I think there's a vague understanding. I think people generally know that they have to take carbon out of their business in some way. I don't think people really understand the complexity of it. For example, we talk about 3 scopes in carbon emissions. The scope 1 things that a business directly controls. There's the scope 2 emissions, which are the emissions that come from purchased energy, so power stations and so on. Happens to be very high in Ireland because we still burn a lot of coal to produce energy. Renewables are reducing that intensity. And then there's the famous scope 3 emissions, which for anybody, probably 70 to 80% of your emissions, depending on the nature of your business. Those are things that are occurring upstream and downstream of you. They're occurring because of you, but they're not created by you. So they're things that your suppliers are doing to produce inputs for you. So if I, for example, are running a plastics extrusion business and I'm buying virgin polyethylene terephthalate pallets from Thailand, I'm not asking the question about where his energy is coming from or the carbon intensity of his project. When I dig down deeper into it, I find that, well, that whole plastic resin producing business is increasingly shifted to high emission economies as opposed to cleaner and lower energy producing economies, ones that are using nuclear and hydro and so on. I don't necessarily realize that the carbon intensity has grown exponentially. To me, it's just plastic pellets.
Yeah.
So one of the things that, to your question, people don't understand, and this is the key to the solution, is you need to see right up your value chains where those emissions are occurring, and you need to be in a close collaboration with those value chains to bring them down.
Is it more expensive, though, to move away from that particular high emission producer to the lower emission, more carbon friendly, environmentally friendly, generally?
At first glance, yes. Take steel, for example. Yeah. When we make steel, we burn coke to break down ferrous oxide to separate the oxide and leave us with the ferrous, from which we make steel. That's something that's enormously energy intensive, and of course burning coke gives you process emissions of carbon dioxide. When you burn carbon, you mix it with oxygen, you get carbon dioxide. When you make steel, you get an awful lot of it. Now, there are plenty of cutting-edge technologies coming out in the steel production business that are looking to take that process emission that comes from the burning the coke out. I mean, the Japanese, for example, are looking at using hydrogen to separate the oxygen out of ferrous oxide. When you get hydrogen with the oxygen you want to take out, what do you get?
I don't know.
Every schoolboy knows H2O is water, relatively harmless. So H2O is much better to be emitting up into the sky than CO2. Yeah. So those technologies, because they're in their nascent stage, are, and like everything new, is more expensive and not yet at a scalable level. So, and there are companies, leadership type companies around the world that are paying a premium voluntarily because they want to encourage those technologies to scale. And then, like everything else, when they do scale, they become cheaper and eventually become a superior cost alternative. We've seen that with wind, we've seen that with solar, we'll see that with hydrogen application for making steel and other things.
So I had that eureka moment when you said the H2O was water, and every schoolboy, I wasn't there that day, but are you seeing that same sort of eureka moment in the faces of clients, and if there's a gap analysis done, kind of, look, here's something that you might look at?
All the time. And you don't have to go very far to find examples. I mean, we have a client here in Ireland called Envitec. Envitec set out to create a technology to process biohazardous waste. So what does that mean? Well, there are labs in every pharma company, in every hospital, independently, and most food production companies doing ongoing tests and all kinds of things. Now, because they're testing things that are considered to be biohazardous, which might be salmonella tests in a food plant, or blood tests or urine tests in a hospital or something like that, those things all have to be treated as biohazardous. Okay? For decades, biohazardous waste has been treated the same way all around the world. We put it through an autoclave, which is to steam sterilize it. We then, by legislation, are required to make it unrecognizable. So one good way of doing that is burning it. And then you're left with this slag heap of ash, of this incinerated, mostly plastics. And what do we do with that? We dig a hole in the ground and we put it in. So we steam, we burn, we bury. They came to us originally and they said, we got this technology that we know works. It removes the pathogens. But the great news is that instead of ending up with something that has to be put in a landfill, we end up with this clean, mixed polymer material that we can recycle. So we've got a circular solution. And wouldn't that be great? Because now we can go back to the guys who made the test tubes or the Petri dishes or whatever it was, the catheters, and say, we can give you clean feedstock that you can then say you're incorporating into what you use. It'll be lower cost than the virgin pellets made in that high emission Asian country. And by the way, you can also get tax breaks for incorporating that recycled, recovered material. And wouldn't that be great? So their original value proposition was circularity.
Yeah.
And when we got into the discussion, you kick ideas around and you suddenly say, well, do you know what? Those activities of autoclaving, burning and burying are high emission activities. Why don't we add carbon into it as well? So all of a sudden we quantified, not all of a sudden, we quantified what would happen in the two different technologies, theirs versus the legacy approach. And we come to discover there's about a 90% difference depending on certain variables of the company. So all of a sudden that became a mantra for them. You asked about a light bulb moment. That was a light bulb moment. That then led them to incorporate that into their value proposition. So not only are we giving something circular and making recycled products out of it, but we're reducing emissions. And then that spurred further ideas. And then they said, you know what? Our people need to be literate enough to have this conversation with all of our stakeholders. Because we're not just talking to customers. We're talking to other technology providers, regulatory agencies, and on and on and on. And everybody right across the functions in our own business have got to be sufficiently literate. So come in and teach us.
Yeah.
And then that really took shape.
And in doing that, you mentioned all those different stakeholders and people who have a vested interest, be it the provider, the manufacturer, the user at the end of the day, the regulator. There's a lot of politics then probably involved. How do you manage the political dynamics that are involved in educating other businesses?
I think by trying to provide direction, because you quickly get involved in an acronymic salad. There's voluntary programs, there's buzzwords and initials, and which has really confused everybody. We started here this conversation by saying, "Do people know what to do?"
Yeah,
they're just bloody confused. Is the problem. So one of the things we do is we provide a bit of clarity and direction. When you ask, and the EU is trying to do this as well, because up for the last 15 or 20 years, the activity that you have seen from corporates in particular has been voluntarily driven. We're trying to meet this voluntary certification standard. We're aligned to the Science Based Targets Initiative. We're members of the Carbon Disclosure Project. They're all private sector organizations who exist to add credibility to what you're doing. Well, we're aligned with these people, so therefore we're good. The EU looks at all of that and says, you know what, it's good, but it's voluntary. And it really isn't delivering the results as quickly or as comprehensively as the world needs. So we're going to distill all this into regulation. So now you have several key pieces of legislation coming out from the EU that make all of these good and directionally correct things into law. And those two laws are primarily CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and CBAM, which is a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Those two things will drive what companies do for the next 10 years, way more than we even realize, I think.
I'm just thinking as people who might be watching this or listening to this are hearing certain terminologies and whatnot, and they might be running a cafe or they might have a printing business. What companies need you? What companies need carbon action?
Well, no company escapes some responsibility for doing something. I think there's a sense that there's no sort of silver bullet for climate change. There's silver buckshot, thousands and thousands of solutions, and every corporate actor really needs to be part of that, regardless of what business you run. The challenge is finding what's going on in your space and to be sure you're doing something about it. And I would say, to the point of the challenge versus opportunity debate, with that challenge comes opportunity, because what we're finding, and the commercial light bulb, is often that people discover that once they become knowledgeable and their people become literate and have these discussions with their customers, they find they're pushing an open door. The big customers want to deal with people who are so aligned because the bigger guys are already there. The bigger guys are pushing the standards. The bigger guys are looking at their own supply chains and they're asking, what are you doing? And it's no longer good enough to say, well, we make sustainable products here. They want to see the granularity of what you're doing. So the better you can talk that game and the more you can incorporate, sustainable strategies largely written and decarbonization in particular into your business plans, the more successfully you'll grow your business. And we've seen that over and over again.
You mentioned the coke and the steel and the coal and everything. That takes us back to a time when we didn't know our ancestors and the Industrial Revolution and steam power and everything. Yes, I know, but it was coal that was providing the power. Are we in a new industrial revolution, or do we need a new industrial revolution to try and help protect the planet?
I always say that technology change got us into the problem, and harnessing different technologies is necessary to get us out. It's either that or go back to the Stone Age. And I think that might be difficult to bring about. So technology it is. That makes it an industrial revolution. Antonio Gutierrez said well before me that climate change is actually the biggest existential threat the planet's ever seen. It's also the biggest opportunity for business since the Industrial Revolution, because it profoundly changes everything. I'm just thinking about companies that we've dealt with that have seen that opportunity and crystallized it into strategies. We talked about Envitech earlier on. That's a transformative technology. But they're not alone. They're everywhere. Talk to Undo Carbon in the UK. These are the people who took science that said basalt is very good at binding atmospheric CO2 and mineralizing it into rock. They said, okay, we know that about basalt. It's also true about limestone. Yeah. But then they said, well, what if we crushed basalt into dust? Then we expand the surface area of that basalt and it'd be much more efficient because the basalt on the inside of a rock doesn't bind any CO2. It's only the external stuff. So they ground it down into dust. They sell that as agricultural soil, which is a land use change, and land use is actually one of the key drivers of global emissions. So what they're trying to do is trying to turn farmland into not a source of emissions. When you plow a field, you release the carbon that it's sequestering, but the basalt is more than offsetting that by absorbing ambient CO2. So it's a very clean technology. So they built a business around doing that. Oh, and by the way, because soil science is a major challenge to sustain with climate change patterns and so on, different changes in rainfall patterns, changes in heat, soil structure breaks down, which then makes soil erosion a problem, okay? So soil blows away. So people have to supplement the soil. Topsoil is only a couple of feet deep all around the world. It's what we rely on to grow food. Talk about sustainability. We could all starve, you know? We have 4 times the population here that we had in 1920 on the planet. There's 8 billion when there used to be 2. And our soil is literally blowing away. And people wonder, well, why are we talking about sustainability? That's one good reason.
Well, it is, and that is food for thought, pardon the pun.
Indeed.
Just finally, Brian, is carbon change real? Is it happening? You know, we have the doubters, we have others. I think you're kind of proving it is, but is carbon good? Is it bad?
Well, the world is not rid of Trump supporters just yet. There's plenty of people out there. I think that's just denial, because it's natural to fear change, and we do have existential challenge, and we do need profound change to deal with it. It's either that or the planet will be okay, but we won't. So that's a difficult reality for people to grasp, but it's absolutely real. We talk about fossil and biogenic carbon all the time in this business. Biogenic carbon is the natural carbon cycle. You remember studying photosynthesis when you were in school? Plants take CO2 from the atmosphere, use it as food.
I was there that day.
Yeah, and they emit the oxygen back into the atmosphere, improves air quality, and they store the carbon. Plant or the tree dies and it sinks into the ground, and over millennia that ground gets more and more compressed, and the carbon in cellulose becomes turf, and then it becomes coal, and if you leave it for long enough it becomes a diamond. That's all fine, but there's a natural balance in the carbon cycle. The animals that are ruminants breathe out methane, which becomes carbon dioxide. The plants that are there eat that carbon dioxide, and before humans came along, that carbon cycle was more or less in balance. Yeah. Well, then humans came along and started digging up the fossilized carbon, the stuff that was 20 feet down in the ground and was now coal, and started burning that. That disrupted that natural global carbon balance that was happening in nature. And that's why we have a problem. You take that carbon, whether it's coal or oil, and you put a match to it, you create a chemical reaction, you fuse it with the oxygen that the plants are emitting, and that creates CO2. CO2 is one, and only one, greenhouse gas. It's 72% of the greenhouse gases approximately that's up in the upper atmosphere. The problem with a greenhouse gas is it traps heat. So what happens is the sun emits white light, hits the land and the oceans during the day, and it tries to escape back out in the night. It doesn't get back through the cloud on the way back. It gets through it on the way down. It doesn't get there on the way back because it travels back as infrared radiation, whose wavelength is actually larger than white light, and that gets trapped by the greenhouse layer. So the heat keeps building up, and that creates profound change. It's science. It's a fact. And as you say, maybe you had to be in school that day to learn all this, but some people don't know it, aren't aware of it, don't accept it, but it's fact.
Well, as the saying goes, every day is a school day. Brian, thanks a million.
Good to be with you. Thank you, John.
If you would like more information, please visit our website, occupli.com. Occupli, putting safety to work for over 25 years.